Hi, everybody. Glad to have you with us today. Thanks for joining. I'm Vivian Schiller, Executive Director of Aspen Digital, program of the Aspen Institute. We're here today to talk about press freedom. Many world leaders, even in democracies, have contentious relationships with the press. This is not unusual. George Orwell once said, journalism is printing what someone else does not want printed. Everything else is public relations. But with autocracy and illiberalism on the rise in many parts of the world, media freedom has been increasingly under attack, declining for 10 straight years, according to Freedom House, which records such things. This was the case before the pandemic took hold. And now, when evidence-based reporting is more critical than ever before, autocrats are exploiting the crisis to consolidate their hold on power. Target number one, independent news media. One of the most common tactics lately is to criminalize reporting and the reporters who hold them to account. In many cases, it's under the guise of cracking down on so-called fake news, with the government leaders as the ultimate arbiters of what is true. We know how that goes. So today, I am really pleased to say we have a stellar group who can illuminate this issue. First, we'll hear from Joel Simon, the Executive Director of Committee to Protect Journalists. In fact, he wrote an important piece about this very issue in the Columbia Journalism Review. We're about to drop that link into the chat function in case you want to read it later. Joel will give us the context of what's happening now during the pandemic when it comes to press freedom. We'll then be joined by reporters coming to us live from 4 continents: India, Hungary, Uganda, and Honduras, all countries where press freedom is under attack. They will share what they are experiencing on the ground. And in the back half of our session, we'll take your questions. If you go to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. You can press on that anytime. You can do it now, you can do it later, and you can enter your questions there. We'll be collecting those questions, and my colleagues will help curate those questions, and we will get to them and submit those to our panelists a little bit later. I'd ask, if you feel comfortable, to please add both your name and your affiliation, just give some great context. And then finally, before I turn things over to Joel, I just want to add apologize in advance, because this technology can get a little bit wonky. We've had pretty good success with these Zoom meetings lately, but if something goes wrong, if somebody disappears, if we have to log back in, just please bear with us and apologies for that in advance. So with that, let's get going. I'd like to bring Joel Simon on with me now. Hi, Joel. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Vivian, and thank you so much for inviting us into your home, such as it is. I mean, not that you had any choice. We're all inviting people into our homes, and just to set the scene here, I'm in my apartment in Brooklyn, and there are 3 wonderful toddlers upstairs who are trapped at home and running back and forth. So if you hear some thumping, that's what it is.
Well, it's all part of the ambiance.
Absolutely.
So thanks, Joel. So we're gonna turn it over to you now to give us some context, and then I'll be back with our other panelists after we hear from Joel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this opportunity and to talk about a very troubling moment in press freedom. I want to start with the first slide, so let's go to that. Okay. So, I should note that CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, what we do is we defend the rights of journalists around the world, and we've been doing that since 1981. And one of the key benchmarks we use is the number of journalists imprisoned around the world each year. And this chart, therefore, gives a reasonably good sense of press freedom has fared over the last 2 decades, which the headline here is not well. One point that has become clear to me is that authoritarian governments are always that are seeking to manage and control information are always acting opportunistically. They take advantage of the prevailing rhetorical and ideological frameworks to justify sweeping crackdowns on dissent, and there has never been an opportunity like COVID-19. So let me take you through this data. The Soviet Union, of course, represented an entire political system based on the control and management of information. So it's not surprising that in the aftermath of the Cold War, we saw an explosion of press freedom around the world that lasted roughly until 2000. At the end of that year, we recorded 92 journalists in jail around the world, and that's the lowest number we ever recorded, and that's the trough on the graph. The following year, with the advent of the war on terror, following the September 11th attacks, the number of journalists in jail jumped to 113 as governments around the world used the anti-terror framework to crack down on press freedom. The color revolutions in Eastern Europe, the Arab Spring, showed the ways that people could use information to mobilize and challenge entrenched autocracies, and in some cases they succeeded, thrillingly. But where they failed, governments recognizing the threat cracked down on online expression, leading to the next surge of imprisonments around the world. That's at the end of, and then you'll see another surge, which sort of began at the end of 2016 and took us to the record levels we see today. And that corresponds to the growing use of fake news laws around the world to crack down on the press once again. At the end of 2016, there were 10 journalists jailed around the world for reporting false news. At the end of last year, there were 30. Next slide, please. As it turns out, fake news is the perfect framework for suppressing real news about COVID-19 because there is an undeniable threat to public health caused by disinformation. As I mentioned, the article that I wrote for Columbia Journalism Review, which Vivian distributed, the WHO has repeatedly emphasized that accurate, timely information is essential to fighting this global health emergency, both in terms of setting public policy and also to ensure that people can make informed decisions about their lives. So today, I believe we're living through what could be fairly characterized as an unprecedented wave of repression around the world geared towards suppressing the work of the media. Call it the COVID-19 crackdown. Let me take you on a global tour culled from CPJ's research. So let's start with Hungary, because we're going to be hearing more about it. March 13th, revision to the criminal code includes a false news measure. Anyone who disseminates information that could hinder the government's response to the epidemic could face 5 years in prison. India. The government has demanded that journalists publish only official information, claiming that fake or inaccurate information could cause panic. It is sought to make this directive legally enforceable. Russia, where there already is a fake news on the books, on March 30th, Russian lawmakers approved fines of up to $25,000 and prison terms of up to 5 years for anyone who spreads what is deemed to be false information about COVID-19. And media outlets could also be fined up to $127,000. South Africa, the disaster management regulations criminalizes the publishing of any statement through any media, including social media, around certain kinds of information related to the COVID-19 response. Violators could spend 6 months in jail or face fines or both. Zimbabwe, regulations that criminalize spreading falsehood on coronavirus, 20 years in jail. Iran's parliament passed a measure to stem criminalize false news around coronavirus. Prison sentence, 3 years. The Philippines, Taiwan, Bangladesh. The Information Ministry announced that it has formed a new unit to monitor social media and various television outlets for rumors. Thailand, ministerial decree bans reporting on information regarding COVID-19 which is untrue and may cause panic. Egypt pressured reporters to downplay the number of infections, going so far as to revoke the credentials of a Guardian correspondent and reprimanding the bureau chief of the New York Times because of a tweet. Honduras. We're going to hear more about Honduras, but there the government suspended the clause of the Constitution that prohibits censorship and protects the right to free expression. Let me take you through some arrests. In the Dominican Republic, on March 27th, police detained a reporter accusing him of causing confusion among the population. Venezuela, a journalist, Darventin Rojas, was arrested by Venezuelan special forces on March 22nd. Nigeria, 5 journalists arrested Kenya, 2 journalists arrested. Journalists arrested in Ethiopia, 2 journalists arrested in Iran, Liberia, at least 8 journalists detained in Turkey. That list is not complete. Next slide. So fake news is not the only rationale that we're seeing to justify suppression of reporting around COVID-19. Our staff has created an internal database with around 200 cases. Not all of these are verified or vetted, but we're starting to see some trends, and these are some of the other things that we're seeing around the world. I mentioned the kind of legal harassment, but let's go to the next slide. There's also physical attacks. We've seen them in Slovenia and Iraq. There's also restrictions on access. We've seen government officials, for example, block access to press conferences in Brazil, Nigeria, Iraq, in this country as well, unfortunately. We've seen challenges for freelancers who don't have credentials and can't get into public meetings or access to relevant information they need to cover the story. We've seen suspensions of FOIA requests in many countries around the world, and we've seen internet restrictions and shutdowns. Next slide. Content moderation and management, and moderation, restrictions and moderation. We've seen suspension of media licenses. Regulators in Iraq suspended Reuters for license for 3 months. They fined it 25 million dinars, which is about $21,000 for their critical coverage. We've seen removal of content. Russia's an example. They ordered news outlets to remove articles about COVID-19 outbreak from their websites in Russia. Next slide. Surveillance, new powers that have been granted to governments. The government contention, and there's obviously some validity around this, is that being able to track movements is essential to combating the pandemic, but of course that has implications for the work of journalists. We don't see proper oversight. We see restrictions on or limitations. We see a very, very dangerous precedent, and we don't see technology companies taking appropriate steps to ensure that information is aggregated and not individualized, which could have obviously significant impact on the ability of journalists to cover this story. Next slide, please. All right, I want to take a step back now and talk about what's at stake here beyond the individual cases. We all know the story of how Chinese authorities suppressed early warnings about the spread of the virus in Wuhan. They arrested a whistleblowing ophthalmologist, Li Wenliang, who later died. There's a videographer, Chen Qiushi, who documented the early outbreaks. He remains missing and unaccounted for in China. China's been cracking down on the international media coverage as well, initially expelling 3 Wall Street Journal reporters, then in a tit-for-tat escalation as the US capped the number of visas available to employees of Chinese media companies in the US. China revoked the visas for at least 13 additional reporters working for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. China then escalated further, forcing out local news assistants working for American media. And if you know anything about China coverage, these Chinese news assistants are absolutely vital for coverage of China. And the dwindling international media presence in China and the tightened restrictions, they've really just reduced the critical scrutiny on the government's remarkable claims, including its recent assertion that community spread has basically halted in China. That's something that that needs to be tested. More broadly, China is now using its state media and global propaganda network to try and rewrite history. State censorship and active information management is a critical part of the Chinese response to COVID-19, even as the pandemic has spread throughout the rest of the world. And China's framing of this, that information control is essential to combating the disease. They've also used their propaganda network to spread malicious rumors that the virus was developed as a biological weapon by the US military, and that framing has gained currency around the world in places like Iran and Russia. And so I just think countries around the world that have stood up for press freedom need to actively challenge this narrative, because there's a grave risk that it's actually taking hold around the world. They need to be praising the work of journalists not attacking journalists for asking tough questions. They need to be actively making the case that a free press is a vital asset in the fight against the pandemic because it represents the best system that we have to ensure that the distribution of timely and accurate information, and it's the best way we have to hold leaders to account. Unless we have global leadership making the case for press freedom, we will lose the battle of ideas and a narrative being written by China will take hold. This pandemic has been a terrible ordeal and it may get worse, but it will pass unless we take action to protect our shared global information system and the free circulation of information of ideas, which is its bedrock. The damage done will be long lasting or even permanent. Now I have two other slides I want to show you before we go to the discussion. One is some resources. So in addition to the work that CPJ is doing to document the extent of this global outbreak and push back against this narrative that we need to control information in order to fight the pandemic, we've also launched a global campaign to get the record number of journalists in prison around the world out of jail because COVID-19 is spreading through the world's prison. Journalism should not be a death sentence. We need your support. So there's a petition, again, we'll put it in the chat where you can sign and add your name. If you support our efforts to win the release of journalists in prison around the world, we would be very grateful to have your support. And the other thing we're doing, next slide please, is we're trying to keep journalists safe as they cover the pandemic. And what we've done is we've produced detailed safety information that's specific to the work that journalists do. And we've translated that into 35+ languages and we've disseminated it to journalists around the world. And if you would find these resources useful and can share them and help get them into the hands of journalists who might need them, we would appreciate that very much. And with that, I'll wrap up. And Vivian, let's chat.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Joel. What's so infuriating about this situation, of course, is that you say rightfully that this pandemic will pass, but part of the way this pandemic will pass is if citizens have the information they need to stay safe and not spread the disease, and that's exactly what's at risk when information cannot be shared by reporters. You know, one thing that strikes me from your presentation is that there are, of course, on the list of countries that you name, many that have long been suppressing independent media. But it also seems like there are some countries that we have that haven't really been on that sort of worst offenders list, South Africa and a few other places. Am I right in saying there are countries that have not been as active in suppressing media using the pandemic as a way to squash reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I think no country is immune. You know, we've been talking to journalists working in Spain and Italy, for example, and, you know, obviously there's a lockdown, but journalists need, you know, the work that they do is essential and they need to be able to move around. And, you know, they're not able to do that necessarily. And they're being confronted by the police and they're saying, you know, I'm a journalist, I need to go out and report the story. And they're saying, no. So, you know, and these are countries that are democratic members of the European Union, but they have a history of authoritarian structures. And so when we see that kind of thing happening, it alarms us. I mean, I think the other thing to keep in mind is
certainly is alarming. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's go ahead.
No, I just want to make one other point before we open it up, which is that, you know, one of the things that we see governments around the world, including the ones that you described, the more democratic ones, is accurate reporting around the number of cases. This is a dynamic we saw play out in the United States, where the government sought to downplay the Trump administration, the extent and the risk, and because they're balancing, you know, the economic costs of the measures that they need to impose in order to constrain the spread of the pandemic. And so we're seeing around the world when journalists are challenging the official count of cases, they're getting in trouble, they're getting suppressed, sometimes they're being arrested.
Yeah, well, we've already got questions coming in about the United States. We'll come back to that later when we get to the Q&A. In the meantime, I'd like to bring our journalists in from all over the world. As they are beginning to join us, just a reminder to everybody, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, the Q&A button, click that. Please start submitting your questions. We're going to get to them soon. If you feel comfortable, please add your name and your affiliation. It's always very helpful and interesting. Oh, and also where you're coming from. We'd like to know where in the world you are. It looks like, have we got everybody? Let's see. Looks like we have, I'm not sure if it's my Wi-Fi. We have everybody. Okay, great. So that's going to be my Wi-Fi. So please welcome, please, I'd ask you to wave your hand so everybody knows who you are as I introduce you. Szabolcs Pani, who's coming to us from Budapest in Hungary. Jennifer Avila, who is coming to us from Tegucigalpa in Honduras. Daniel Kalanaki in Kampala, Uganda. And Raksha Kumar, who is coming to us from Mumbai in India. Thank you so much for joining us. We are now, I'd like to ask each of you to just talk a little bit about what you were experiencing in your country. I think that Joel actually gave a little context about each. Szabolcs, we're going to start with you. We are concerned for you about the legislation that would punish anyone who publishes so-called false information about coronavirus with up to 5 years in prison. How is that impacting your ability to report, and what are you experiencing on the ground?
Hello, Vivian. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'd also like to say hi to our audience. So as Joel already mentioned, Hungary's case, what happened is that Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who's been in power since 2010, he has a so-called constitutional or supermajority in parliament. He pushed through a so-called emergency law on March the 30th. And among other things, this law has a certain paragraph that would punish those people, it's not specified who, those people who spread falsehood or distorted truth connected to the pandemic or the government's initiatives to contain it. I'm going to quote the law just to show you how vague it is, and this is exactly the problem with it. Persons who under extraordinary rule of law claim or spread a falsehood or claim or spread a distorted truth before the grand public that is suitable for obstructing or preventing successful protection commit a crime that is punishable by 1 to 5 years of prison. So ever since the draft of this law has been introduced to the public, everyone's guessing what is distorted truth, who's going to identify what is truth, what is distorted truth, and also what does it mean that it's suitable for obstructing. So it doesn't actually have to obstruct anything. It's enough if it's suitable to obstruct or prevent successful protection. It's so vague that basically no lawyer working for a newspaper or a TV or any other outlet can seriously say that if we publish an article, it won't get into legal trouble. So one problem is that this law creates a huge uncertainty. No one actually knows how this law will be implemented. I'm quite sure that they're not going to jail journalists. That doesn't happen in Hungary, or at least not yet. There's a certain deterioration in press freedom, but Viktor Orbán and his government never crossed that red line of using either violence or jailing journalists. But this new law is quite worrying. And what I also like to add is the context of it. So the Hungarian government, inspired by Donald Trump, has been accusing us independent journalists or critical journalists of spreading fake news for years now, which means that there is already this talking point in government officials' statements that those who are not favoring the government, they are basically spreading fake news. they have been saying this about us for years now. Now just put together that thing and this new law, which is very vaguely describing a punishment for anyone who spreads distorted truth. So this really adds to this uncertainty. I'd also like to add that there are certain government officials who are basically naming and shaming not only Hungarian journalists, but also foreign correspondents based in Budapest. They are openly accusing them of spreading falsehoods, and they have been doing this, as I said, for years. Now there's this legal possibility to basically send the police on the journalists. As I said, I don't really believe they're going to do this, but just the anxiety, just this uncertainty that's surrounding the law is very discouraging. What I already feel is that sources, people who would like to leak us information, or people who would just sit down with us for a background conversation, are also worried that they too might get into trouble if we're getting sued because of spreading, falsehoods or fake information. So that's also a consequence that is already felt here on the ground in Budapest.
Thank you. Well, I mean, on the one hand, I'm glad to hear that no journalists are being jailed, but the chilling effect that you describe is really disturbing. And of all times, it's during the coronavirus, it's hard enough for reporters risking their own personal health to report. So that's really disturbing to hear. But thank you. We'll come back to you in a little bit. I want to now turn it over to Raksha. Raksha, we have been hearing, the New York Times has been doing quite a bit of reporting that Modi's lawyers have persuaded the Supreme Court to order all media to publish the quote unquote, only the quote unquote official version of coronavirus developments, i.e. what the government is choosing to report. How are you, is that your experience? Do you feel like you and other reporters in India are able to report on what you're seeing on the ground?
Thank you, Vivian. So there are two aspects to this, and I just want to put the whole Supreme Court judgment in context. So some of us have been able to, let's say, quote the Johns Hopkins University figures on deaths on cases that have been tested positive. So we have access to information that is outside the quote unquote official information circles. But having said that, the larger media outlets, so the television channels which report on the crisis, the newspapers, these are the ones that reach the largest number of Indians, and they have all been, because it's now become some kind of an official mandate, they have all been sticking to reporting on the official figures or the official line, and this official line, and I think that's important to consider, because the Prime Minister and the Health Minister of India have not given a press conference to journalists at all. So whatever is the official line comes from a relatively junior bureaucrat at the Ministry of Health in New Delhi. So here is this person who is a joint secretary. So he comes after several senior bureaucrats, who is the only person who is interacting with the media, and that becomes the official line, which a lot of us are now forced to quote. But there is a tiny bit of context that becomes important here when we are talking about the Supreme Court judgment. So the Supreme Court said everything, but stopped short of saying that the government that the journalist should follow the government line. This is an interpretation by the central government of the Supreme Court judgment. So it said that there is a Disaster Management Act, which is a piece of legislation that says any person who is caught spreading misinformation at the time when she's facing disaster can be imprisoned. There are several punitive measures for that person, but the Supreme Court essentially quoted all of this and just stopped short of saying all journalists are mandated to follow the official line and nothing else. This is an interpretation by the central government, but there has been such a broad-based interpretation of this that no journalist has been able to question the central government at all. So by default, we've all been, using we've all been quoting the junior bureaucrat from the Ministry of Health. We've all kind of not been allowed into the press conferences, even of the junior bureaucrat. There have been state media that have, only the state media that have been allowed to ask questions, or media, very few media that favor the government explicitly.
Thank you, Raksha, and apologies, folks. That was the audio. What went in a little for the fact that the audience, the audio went in a little about in and out. I will remind you that we are coming to you from literally 5 continents right now. So let's just be glad that this is working at all. But thank you for sharing your observation and that context, Raksha. That's very important. We're going to turn it over now to Jennifer. Jennifer, in Honduras, as Joel reminded us, the government responded to the outbreak by suspending the aspects of the Constitution that prohibit censorship and protect the right to free expression. That's certainly concerning when it comes to independent journalism. Please tell us what you're experiencing and seeing in Honduras when it comes to reporting about the pandemic.
Yes, we have the first days of the first 12 days of the curfew with the suspension of Article 72, which expressed about freedom of expression, but it was suspended on March 27th, thanks to international organizations and also national media, that we were asking the government to suspend this measure of restricting freedom of expression. But that doesn't mean that things are better right now, you know. On March 1st, so 4 days after suspending this restriction, 3 reporters were in detention by the police during their daily coverage in a small town in Santa Barbara. So their material was erased, they were detained, they are local reporters. So these threats in small towns are worse because of police connected to organized crime or things that are happening on these small towns. So I think, or what we have analyzed, that the curfew is only an excuse in these kind of cases. We also don't have a better panorama about public information. We are experiencing several kinds of information lockdown. We don't have Transparency Institute working right now, is closed, so they are not accepting any FOIA request. So we are not having public information. The government is also giving all the information through press conferences that are not press conferences because they don't allow journalists to ask. And they are not allowing journalists to ask to the authorities that are in charge of the emergency. So here in Honduras, we have one of the highest rates of journalists murdered, and also we have information lockdown through a lot of years. Now in the curfew, we think this is like an excuse or also a way to legitimate these measures that we have just have a few years ago. Now they are publishing incomplete information, and we are not allowed to ask the authorities what about the contracts or what about the budget execution in this emergency. Also, a few days ago, and this is very concerning for us, an NGO called CIPRO, they received information from healthcare personnel showing a confidential agreement that in which they cannot express any opinion or information qualified as reserved or confidential to media in Honduras. And we have a secrecy law, and it is the president who says what is confidential or secret. So if real data about COVID-19 is qualified as threat to this national security, it will be secret. It is impossible for the press to investigate the truth about all this matter. So even though we have like the freedom of expression right, we don't have this restriction no more after March 27. We have an information lockdown that is not helping us to investigate what's happening here. And we also have this issue not only on Honduras, in Central America. In El Salvador, for example, they have a president that is qualifying as a public enemy to the press that is trying to investigate the truth about data, because the president is monopolizing information. That's happening in Central America, in the whole region. And it's very concerning for us. It's also very difficult for us to investigate in this matter.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that. And I just want to just a note to the audience. Both Joel and Jennifer mentioned FOIA. For those of you who are not immersed in all this like we are, that's FOIA is FOIA, and it's Freedom of Information Act, which is the ability to request documents from the government, official documents from the government. And it's always a struggle in the best of times, but this is not the best of times. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of that context. Daniel, talk to us, please, about what's happening on the ground in Kampala in Uganda, and what you're experiencing in terms of your ability to freely report.
Thank you, Vivian, for organizing this. I want to begin with some positive news for a start, because in Uganda, like many countries, there is a lockdown and restrictions on movement, and the journalists were included among the essential services. So we still can go out, you know, like the doctors, like the emergency services, and I think that's a good thing. You need permits to do that, and there were limited numbers of permits that were made available, which basically means that you only have a few journalists, you know, able to go out and report during the day, and there's a curfew in the night, so pretty much there's no coverage, you know, after dusk. But the other kind of important things to note, we had a television station owner who was arrested for appearing. He's a pastor and it's a religious TV. He appeared on his TV station questioning, you know, the COVID pandemic. He was basically saying, this is, you know, we've had the flu before. And he's been arrested because of that. And I think someone was speaking earlier about the chilling effect that that brings to the rest of the journalists. We've also had reporters who've been physically attacked, you know, for being on the road after curfew hours. And even when they've identified themselves as being journalists, we've had about 3 or 4 who've actually been physically attacked. We also had warnings from the regulator over what people we hosted on our TV stations said, you know, in the course of the program. And, you know, they had different views about the pandemic. And even when we issued a statement afterwards saying that, you know, we do not think that those views are correct, questioning the science of it, there was a warning from the regulator. So there is a chilling effect in terms of, you know, what you're able to say. There are restrictions on the ability to actually go out and do the journalism. But I also want to raise a different dynamic to what we're seeing in terms of freedom of expression, in that the economic impact of what is going on will obviously affect very many industries, but it's going to particularly affect media industries. We've seen print circulation, for instance, pretty much slide to access the newspapers. We've seen advertising, you know, slump significantly in broadcast and in print formats. And I think one of the things to think about from a freedom of expression and from a media sustainability viewpoint is how many media houses will actually survive the economic effects of the pandemic.
That is actually an excellent point. I'm so glad you brought that up, Daniel. First of all, I'm glad that first of all, just in the spirit of your good news, I'm glad that journalists are considered essential workers and are not subject to lockdown. Hopefully, everybody's taking the right precautions. But you raise a really important point. On top of the political pressure, the economic pressure on independent news organizations who are already having trouble before this hit is devastating. We're seeing that throughout the United States as well when it comes to local news organizations. It is very troubling, and we are so hopeful that even as news organization, as news consumption has skyrocketed, that more people around the world will see fit to support their local independent news organizations. We're now going to turn to audience questions. A reminder again, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please drop your questions in there with your name and your affiliation and where you are in the world right now, if you see fit. We're getting quite a few questions about what's happening in the United States, and I promise you we will come to that, but I'm going to keep the focus on other parts of the world for a few minutes, and then we will get there. So this question comes to us from Hamad Sarfaz, who is joining us from Pakistan. He asks, how do journalists deal with a consistent effort by the state to discredit them? I could turn this question over to any of you, I'm sure, but I think I will direct this one at Saboch to talk about it, since you, Viktor Orban, of course, has been quite vocal critic of reporters for quite a long time, to take this one on.
Excellent question. So it's a huge dilemma, both personally and professionally, for a journalist. How do you react if a government spokesman, if a government minister attacks you, names you, shames you personally? One of their aim is to basically put us in a corner where they can label us as opposition journalists, label us as political activists. So knowing that that is their strategy, I think the best reaction is just to keep calm and stick to professional guidelines. Avoid personal debates and things like that with them. It's not easy. I mean, I have been engaged in some Twitter debates with some of these people. It's very hard not to sometimes. But I think we have to prove day by day that our reporting is unbiased, it's objective, it's based on facts. Whenever we write something that's detrimental to the government or someone connected to the government, we have to give them a fair shake. We have to give them the opportunity to reply, to have their reaction included in the article. So all the basic guidelines. We just have to stick to the old rules, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. This next question comes to us, and apologies if I mispronounce your name, Belen, who is with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center. Their question is, have you noticed, I'm going to direct this one to you, Raksha. I'd be interested to hear your response. Have you noticed any trends against journalists who are part of vulnerable groups being targeted in the context of COVID-19 at an increased rate over their colleagues? By that, this person means women, LGBT journalists, etc.
So in general, I would say that vulnerable groups in the country have had it tough in the last few years. Specifically, women have had it tough. Women journalists have had it tough. But this is where I think it's interesting to see who are the journalists in India. A lot of the journalists spread across the English media, at least, come from a specific socioeconomic group. So upwardly mobile, urban, sections of the society, largely male. You do have a few, you do have women, who've broken the glass ceiling, but then there are relatively fewer. So I'm not really sure if there are specific journalists who are being targeted at the national level, where I'm talking about the English press. But I do understand that a lot of the regional media, in regional media, you do have women who do the bulk of reportage. So Telugu media in the southern part of the country, you have women going into the villages, coming back with a lot of ground reports that then get a lot of attention in state capitals. In the northern part of the country, you do have specific media groups that are run by trans people, specific media groups that are run by the LGBTQ communities. And these are media organizations that are targeted regardless of the pandemic. And I think, as our colleague from Uganda pointed out, these are the media communities that are targeted specifically on the economic front right now. They do not have enough funding and backing, and that essentially means that they cannot really function more. I'm sorry about the pings, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So
We
I
can hear
think
you.
I would say that a huge part of the problem right now with vulnerable communities is at least with respect to India is when it comes to how do you fund your journalism. If you are a media organization that, let's say, is specifically catering to the LGBTQ community, then in any case you have you're on thin ice. So so that would be economically sustaining yourself over a longer period would be one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Jennifer, I'm going to direct this one to you. This comes to us from Elizabeth Myers, who is in Morocco. Her question: foreign correspondents have been warned not to commit, quote, professional misconduct or violate journalistic ethics by reporting inaccurate figures on COVID-19. She says, similar to Hungary's law, the pronouncements are vague, suggesting the suggestion to be only use official numbers that are coming from the government. What do we do about this? And how do we analyze and question those numbers?
Yes, that's a very, very important question, because we always say we need to verify numbers, but the only numbers that we have are the official numbers, and we're not trusting in them. And about how to do our job, so about fake news and about how the coverage needs to be responsible, but that coming from a government that doesn't have legitimacy or that people doesn't trust in it is very difficult to know how to do that. You know, right in Honduras, we are not allowed to say like specific cities in which the cases are. We know about departments or regions, but we don't know specific cities because of the official numbers. So we don't know how many tests we are making a day, and we need just to tell people the official numbers, because that's the only one we have. But we need to put these questions into the public debate. That's the only thing that we have to do, because official or authorities are not answering those questions.
Thank you. I am going to turn this next question over to you, Joel. I promise this comes to us from Philip Webster, who is actually part of the Aspen Institute. He's the founder of the Aspen Y Fellows. He asks, and it'll be interesting to get your perspective, Joel, where do you rate the US versus the rest of the world in its press free in terms of press freedom at risk?
Well, I think that there's a different dynamic here. Sometimes there's what the damage that Trump is doing through his hostile rhetoric towards the media and through his utter and complete failure to show leadership and defend the right, to defend the work that journalists do, and ensure that the U.S. through its foreign policy defends these essential principles. It's actually affecting the people on this call, perhaps more directly than it's affecting journalists in this country, because it's empowering autocrats around the world. We heard the situation in Hungary where Orban has, been sort of emboldened by this new fake news framing. We hear certainly Modi in India, that's a dynamic there as well. And there are many other examples. But I do think that I wouldn't say that kind of rhetoric is necessarily chilling journalism, but it's undermining public trust. It's undermining public trust. And that is something that we so desperately needed. And by constantly, I mean, this is obviously something that's been a characteristic of his entire administration, but by going after the press now, in this context, and attacking journalists who are asking tough questions at press conferences, and by undermining the role that the media plays in a public health emergency like the one we're living through, he's once again failing to engage with the framework that China is putting forward, which is that in moments of crisis like the one we're living through now, there is a role for governments to control and manage information in the public interest. That's basically China's argument. And so I think there's an utter and complete failure of US leadership that's impacting not only people in this country, but the global environment for press freedom and free expression.
Yeah, and I would amplify again your point about that the rhetoric undermines public confidence in the media, which one could strongly argue is part of the point, or part of the point coming from the administration. Daniel, I'm going to direct this one to you. It comes to us from Thomas Baker. He asks, you brought up the important point earlier about the economic insecurity of news organizations. Will powerful people and institutions use this as an opportunity to further consolidate their ownership of newspapers and other media?
In many developing countries, government is the biggest advertiser, or government and government agencies, the biggest advertisers. And I think once this country is going to recession, the World Bank put out a report today saying African countries are going to have their first recession in 25 years. As private sector players scale down on their advertising spend and government becomes ever more important as a source of revenue, I think we're going to see an expansion of restrictions on media freedom, which we had already seen with previous episodes. I think Joel mentioned something about the effects of the post 9/11 and the restrictions on press freedom then. We had a similar case after the Arab Spring with more restrictions on press freedom. And I worry that this time, beyond the legislative restrictions, we're going to see more economic handcuffs put on media.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry for these technical difficulties at the end, but we are going to wrap up now. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here. And we look forward to sharing the video later today or maybe early tomorrow morning. Thank you.